For 20 years, Queen Elizabeth fought a secret war against the woman her son called his wife. And she never once said a single word about it in public. Her weapon was a vault, and inside that vault sat the most priceless jewelry collection in the world. Elizabeth used every single piece in it like a calculated move on a chessboard. She locked away the crowns that belonged to Camilla's title and redirected them one by one to Catherine, deliberately, permanently. By the time Camilla understood what had happened, there was nothing left to fight for. What the Queen did with that vault piece by piece is one of the coldest acts of any monarch in modern history. And the stories behind every single piece will break your heart completely. The woman who was never supposed to be queen. It was just 6 months into the marriage and Camilla was already getting her first real lesson in what it meant to be Elizabeth's daughter-in-law. On one particular occasion, while getting ready for an official engagement with Charles, Camilla moved through the palace rooms with the kind of quiet confidence of a woman who had finally, after decades of waiting, earned her place. She had selected her jewelry from the royal collection, put the pieces on and was walking out to the car. Charles was beside her and staff were moving around them. Everything looked exactly like what it was supposed to be when a senior royal couple heads out on official business. Then the gates flew open. A royal official came speeding through the palace gates and walked directly toward Camilla with a note in his hand. The note was from the Queen's office. It said that the jewelry Camilla was wearing had not been authorized. She had taken the pieces without going through the correct permissions, so she was required to remove them before she went anywhere. Camilla turned to look at Charles, but he dropped his eyes to the ground almost immediately. And there was something deeply telling in that single moment of avoidance. Camilla stood there for a moment that must have felt like it lasted an hour. Then, in front of the staff and the security personnel and anyone else who happened to be standing in that driveway, she reached up and removed the jewelry from her body piece by piece. The people around her looked away or suddenly found something very important to stare at on the ground. When Camilla finally had the pieces in her hands, she looked at Charles one more time, but he still would not meet her eyes. Camilla swallowed everything she was feeling, turned around and walked back into the palace. According to people who were close to her during those early years, Camilla was barely holding herself together when she got back inside. She had been publicly humiliated in her own driveway in front of her own husband, who had stood right beside her and said absolutely nothing. One source close to Camilla recalled that the moment the door shut, she sharply turned to Charles and said, "Is this how it is going to be? Is this what I signed up for? Because if this is what you brought me into, Charles, you should have told me." Charles had no answer for her. He never did when it came to his mother. And that right there was the opening act of what would become a 20-year campaign. Because what happened in that driveway was not a bureaucratic mistake or a procedural misunderstanding. It was Elizabeth establishing on day one that Camilla would wear only what Elizabeth decided she could wear, go only where Elizabeth decided she could go, and represent only whatever Elizabeth decided she was allowed to represent. The title was Charles's gift to Camilla. Everything else belonged to the Queen. Now, to really understand how devastating what came next actually was, you have to understand what the royal jewelry vault actually means inside that family. It is not simply a room full of expensive old pieces. Every single piece in that vault carries the name and the story of the woman who wore it before. When a senior royal woman is granted access to a particular piece, the entire world immediately understands that she has been accepted, that someone with real authority has looked at her and decided she is worthy. And when pieces are withheld from her while everyone around her wears them freely, that message lands just as loudly and just as publicly, except nobody has to say a single word out loud. Elizabeth gave Camilla access to some of the grandest and most theatrical pieces in the collection, which included massive tiaras from the Grill bequest. Pieces so large and so imposing that they projected power from across a ballroom. To anyone looking in from the outside, it appeared that Camilla had been embraced and equipped for her role. But those pieces were completely hollow in terms of meaning. They had no personal history and carried no emotional connection to any previous Princess of Wales. They were mere costumes. Meanwhile, royal household staff had already received quiet verbal instructions that certain other categories of jewelry were not available to Camilla under any circumstances. There was no written memo and no formal royal decree. Just a standing order passed from the Queen's senior dresser to the household team. The kind of instruction that everyone in that building understood completely without needing it repeated. So while Camilla was being dressed in the theatrical pieces, the jewels that actually told a story, the ones that connected a wearer to a specific woman and a specific chapter of royal history, were being quietly and deliberately kept out of her reach. The most devastating proof of this was Queen Alexandra's wedding necklace. In 1863, the future King Edward VII gave it to his new bride, Princess Alexandra of Denmark, as a wedding gift. And from that single moment forward, it became the defining symbol of the Princess of Wales title. The Queen Mother wore it for 50 years after that, cementing it so deeply into the identity of the role that it was almost impossible to separate the two. When the Queen Mother died in 2002, the necklace passed to Elizabeth. And 3 years later, when Camilla married Charles and legally became the Princess of Wales, that necklace belonged to her title. By every rule and every tradition of the royal family, it should have been brought out of the vault and offered to her immediately. Instead, Elizabeth locked it away and left it there for 16 straight years. The necklace did not appear at a single state banquet. It was not worn to a single diplomatic reception. It did not even show up in a single official portrait. The necklace simply vanished from public life as though it had never existed. And then in October of 2018, Catherine walked into a Buckingham Palace state banquet honoring the King and Queen of the Netherlands, and that very necklace was sitting around her neck. Catherine was the wife of Prince William. She was 2 full positions below Camilla in terms of seniority. And yet, she was wearing the defining jewel of Camilla's own title in a room packed with foreign royalty and the world's press, while Camilla was somewhere in that same palace without it. Can you imagine what it felt like for Camilla to see those photographs the next morning? After 16 years of waiting and attending every function and doing everything that was asked of her, Elizabeth had just reached past her in front of the entire world and placed the crown jewel of her own title on someone else's neck without a single word of explanation to anyone. That was not a styling decision. That was Elizabeth picking up her favorite weapon and firing the first shot in a war she had been planning for years. And she was just getting started. Diana's ghost in the vault. If the Alexandra necklace cracked Camilla's foundation, what came next completely destroyed it. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara is not simply a famous royal crown. It is Diana's crown. Every single person who lived through the 1980s and 90s knew that tiara on sight because they had spent years watching it sit on Diana's head in photographs that the entire world could not stop looking at. It was in the portraits. It was at the state banquets. It was plastered across the covers of magazines sold in every country on earth. That tiara and Diana's face had become so deeply connected in the public imagination that separating the two felt almost impossible. And the moment Camilla became Princess of Wales in 2005, that crown was hers by constitutional right. She was the Princess of Wales after all, and the tiara belonged to that title. Instead, Elizabeth sealed it in complete darkness for a full decade. What almost nobody has ever reported is how close that tiara came to disappearing permanently. Sources close to the royal household have described internal discussions in the early 2000s, where Elizabeth's own advisors raised the question of whether the lover's knot should simply be removed from the working collection entirely. Their argument was that its connection to Diana was so overwhelming and emotionally charged that any woman who wore it going forward would be absolutely destroyed by the public comparison to her. Elizabeth shut that conversation down immediately. She was keeping it. She just needed to decide personally and very carefully who wore it next, when they wore it, and on whose terms it happened. In December of 2015, the answer became clear. Elizabeth transferred the lover's knot to Catherine, and the world accepted the handover without a fight because the emotional logic behind it was impossible to argue with. Diana's crown now sat on the head of Diana's own son's wife. It felt like continuity. It felt like the tiara had found its rightful next home. But for Camilla, standing on the outside of all of that, it felt like a door being permanently locked in her face after 10 years of standing outside it in the cold. She had never been allowed through. And now it was sealed forever with someone else's name on it. And if that was not already heartbreaking enough, the pieces that followed told exactly the same story with even more personal brutality. The Bahrain pearl necklace was a gift from the ruler of Bahrain, and Diana had worn it publicly on multiple occasions. It went to Catherine. The Edinburgh wedding bracelet was the piece Prince Philip had given Elizabeth before their own wedding, one of the most tender and private jewels in the entire collection, carrying the memory of the very beginning of Elizabeth's love story with her husband. It went to Catherine. These were not grand institutional pieces designed to project power at state events. These were the jewels of love and memory, the pieces that carried the most intimate and irreplaceable chapters of Elizabeth's personal life. And every single one of them bypassed Camilla as though she was not even standing in the room.